Good evening, fantasy football fans. Welcome to another edition of the Fantasy Slant, brought to you by ProFootballFocus.com Fantasy and powered by DraftKings. This is your normal host, Scott Spratt, back in action this week. Michael was carrying it by himself last week. Luckily, he's very capable of doing that. So, Michael, how are you?
Good. How are you, Scotty?
Well, I'm great. The Panthers are alive and kicking. With the embarrassment of the NFC South has made it so that they're temporarily in first place. We're actually recording this on a Sunday night, so the Eagles game just started. The Saints will play tomorrow night, but yeah. So right now, hanging in there.
Yeah. How disappointed are you that Jimmy Clausen is not getting all of this glory, and it's in fact Derek Anderson? I mean, on a scale of 1 to 10.
Yeah, 11, I guess. I mean, it's definitely a heavy heart, but.
Well, look, if it's any consolation, apparently they're thinking about benching Cutler anyway, so he might still get his chance.
The only thing that would make this better is if Jimmy Clausen led the Bears to victory over the Saints to keep the Panthers in first place tomorrow night. So
it would all come full circle at that point.
Fingers crossed. But Michael, this is a fantasy show, so we do need to talk about some fantasy topics. But I think this week the actual success of NFL teams is going to drive a lot of that discussion. Later on in the show, we'll talk about some of the top 10 wide receivers for 2015 and see if we can rank those guys. See where we put Odell Beckham, who had another tremendous day this week. I don't know if you're in how many fantasy playoffs, Michael, but I was in 3 today where Beckham determined the winner on either side of it. So obviously he's been a huge player.
I was in one where he, I think, literally accumulated half of my opponent's points. So,
yeah, tough break if you faced Odell Beckham this week. Also later in the show, we're going to talk about some of the replacement quarterbacks. There were a lot of guys that, for whatever reason, because of injuries or whatever else, got in this week and could start again next week. Talk about if any of those guys might be viable starters in Week 16. But first, Michael, let's get started by talking about some of the teams that have clinched their destinies. That starts with the 3 teams in the AFC. The New England Patriots at 11-3, they clinched the AFC East. The Indianapolis Colts at 10-4 have clinched the AFC South. And finally, the Denver Broncos at 11-3 have clinched the AFC West. So let's start there, Michael. Let's start it with New England. Does the fact that they've already clinched the East, is that going to affect the playing time of any players that might have fantasy relevance?
Well, let's first keep in mind that hopefully most people are in 16-week fantasy seasons. I mean, I know there's probably a few outliers that do play Week 17, but if you're not and you have your championship in Week 16, personally, I don't have a problem with any Patriots. I mean, not to mention, let's remember, them and Denver are only 1 game up on Indianapolis, and we'll cover this in a second, for home field, which is vitally important. So it's not as if any one of these teams has cleared themselves well ahead of each other. And even if they had, do we really expect Bill Belichick to lay down at any point? I mean, they are constantly in FU mode all of the time. So no, I'm fully confident starting any Patriots going forward.
The one question that I would have is maybe Jonas Gray. I watched a little bit of this game earlier, and Gray got a lot of work in the second half and looked effective, but I'm also wondering whether that was just the case that they were well up on the Dolphins, things were in hand, there was no reason to keep running Blunt if that's the primary back they want to keep healthy moving forward. Are you safe using Blunt next week if he's your running back too?
You're not safe using any Patriots running backs. What are you talking about? No matter if it's Week 1 or Week 16. I mean, Look, Shane Vereen got the rushing touchdown today. That's how wacky that game was. So, look, as far as the usual sketchy suspects in the Patriots offense, look, they're still going to be sketchy next week. But for Mr. Reliable, Tom Brady and Rob Gronkowski, those guys are full go. I'm starting them with no hesitation next week.
Okay, that's good. Let's move to Indianapolis. Again, they're 1 game back, but they are still in the home field race in a manner of speaking. But do you think that the success of New England and Denver might cause them to rest some players? And if so, I mean, do they have any players that would even merit being rested?
Well, they did have T.Y. Hilton tweak a hamstring this week, and it's way too early to determine how severe that's going to be. And I'm looking up their schedule now. Okay, so the Colts play in the afternoon next week, and the Broncos play Monday night. It's not as if, my point is, it's not as if the Colts will know ahead of time that New England and Denver clinched the first round bye enough to sit their own players, if that makes sense. So
It does.
Yeah, assuming everyone's healthy, I would still be starting all the Colts. Like you said, they're still in contention for a first round bye, which again is just as important as home field for the whole thing. So I'm not sitting any of them, but definitely monitor the injury situation. Like I said with Hilton, who has been a top 5 receiver this year in fantasy. It just remains to be seen how severe his injury is. But other than that, I'm all systems go for those guys.
Okay, and then finally with Denver, this one might be the most interesting just because of the state of some of the players on the team. It seemed like Peyton Manning was ill today, but he played anyway. He's probably not really a risk going forward with that. But Julius Thomas, once again, did very little in fantasy this week. Might they just shut him down for the last 2 weeks to see if they can get to full strength going forward?
Well, and back to Peyton, I'm not fully convinced that I would be all systems go with Peyton next week. I mean, not as much as I am with the Patriots or the Colts. I mean, like I said, the Broncos play Monday night next week, so they're going to know ahead of time what the Colts did. And look, the Colts, they're at the Cowboys, so then that's certainly not a rollover game. So it's very possible next week Denver realizes, hey, we've got the 1-game lead. They still could get home field if New England loses, I guess, but I think it's possible they sit not just Thomas, like you said, but might give Manning a break at some point too. I don't know. He just hasn't. Look, he's going through a bit of a funk, and whether that's injury related or not, they'll never admit it. But I'm not 100% that they wouldn't sit Peyton and get him rested for the playoffs.
Okay, let's pretend you're kind of rolling into next week with that fear. You have to figure out what you're going to do before the 1 p.m. games because you just, you can't really risk it necessarily. Is there anything you can do to prepare for it? Like who's the other Sunday night game and who's in the Monday night game? Or is there any player, any quarterback there that you can pick up as a potential backup for Peyton?
Well, okay, so there's 2 different questions. There is a player available, but would you want to? That's entirely different. So
I don't know who the games are, so I'm interested in hearing.
Well, you're going to like this. The Sunday night game is Seattle at Arizona.
Oh no.
So, if you were truly desperate and you wanted to, I don't know that anyone should be that desperate to roll the dice with Brian Lindell. But, and then the Monday night game will be Denver at Cincinnati. So, look, I guess it's possible that maybe Osweiler is still available in fantasy leagues. And with the Monday night start, it makes it very tricky to plan for that. But let's put it this way. If I'm a Peyton Manning owner in fantasy, I am definitely getting Osweiler off waivers this week, just as a precaution.
Let's assume Osweiler is a deep league option then. And so I have one of 2 things that I can do going into the game. I can plan to start whichever Denver quarterback starts, not knowing whether Peyton will be fine for that or not. Or I can just go ahead and start my backup quarterback, who I'll say is Matt Ryan. Mm-hmm. Are you going to go with Ryan, or are you going to wait it out to see what you get from Denver?
Well, man, that's tough. And we've talked a little bit about sort of the gluttony of quarterbacks in that middle range, and a lot of it depends on matchup. So, for example, a guy like Ryan, he's at the Saints next week, which is a pretty plus matchup at this point. So, God, I would give that strong consideration if it were a guy like Ryan over Peyton Manning. I think I really would.
I think at this point you almost have to. Peyton has had a few bad starts in a row, and the uncertainty of the need to win this game, I think, has a lot of implications here too. So for the first time, I may be dropping Peyton more to the middle of the quarterback that have been eliminated from playoff contention, at least maybe not mathematically, but from a practical standpoint. Let's go ahead and shed a tear for your San Francisco 49ers, who lost their 3rd straight to fall to 7-7. They're pretty much out of this thing. Seattle's pulled well ahead, just won again against them. Arizona still wins games, as strange as that can seem. Are there any fantasy players that may be sitting because of injuries on the team, or maybe that might play that are viable because of this their elimination from the playoffs?
Oh, No. I mean, at this point, I think the team is just a train wreck in general. Quite honestly, I mean, honestly, is there one player on that team offensively you could trust right now in fantasy that you would want to roll with?
Okay, I think I do know an answer to this, and it's not anybody in the passing game, obviously, with the way Colin
Okay.
Kaepernick is playing. But I will say that Frank Gore suffered a concussion in this game today, and with a week to go, there's no telling he may be totally fine to go next week. But given the concussion and given Carlos Hyde, the rookie, what he's shown in limited action this year, he's potentially the guy next year. Gore, I don't think, is under contract. Might they just roll with Hyde? I feel like he's a player that you could potentially start as an RB2 if we know more about Gore's status going into the game. He rushed for 55 yards on just 6 carries against Seattle and has really been better than Gore a lot this season. What about Hyde? If Gore's ruled out, I think you would think Hyde is probably a top 20 back, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, San Francisco, they look. There's at the heart of it, there's still a power running offense, and if Hyde's the man, then Hyde's the man. And again, like we've talked about before, just getting a starting running back on your fantasy team is a win in itself. So if you've got a guy like Hyde going on your team, and he's going to get probably 20 carries if Gore's out. Yeah, I would definitely put him as a top 20. And looking at next week, just for the record, they're at home against the Chargers, who not necessarily a great run defense. So yeah, I definitely think if Gore is out, Hyde would be a great option as an RB2.
One extra thing I'll mention there is that game is actually on Saturday. So that's one less day for Gore to recover, and that means that you should probably go ahead and do everything you can to get Hyde on your roster while you figure out that situation, because he's really the guy that I feel like has potentially emerged this week that could be a real play for you. And you'll be able to figure all of that out before you have to make your other decisions. So definitely grab Hyde if that's an option for you. All right, another team that fell to 7-7 this time after 2 straight losses is the Dolphins. That was a pretty bad loss today to the Patriots that could lead to coach firings, etc. But is there anything here from a fantasy standpoint? Any players that may benefit or may suffer because of their potential elimination?
The only one that I can think of that may be worth anything going forward, at least this season, would be probably Landry in the passing game. I mean, he still continues to rack up the catches, even though they're at 3, 4, and 5 yards at a time. He's still getting at least 5 a game. So if you're in a PPR league, definitely I think Landry has proven to be consistent at the very least. But having said that, Mike Wallace had a pretty good game today too. He had over 100 yards. Now it was his first 100-yard game of the season, so it's probably a too little, too late situation there. But it's I don't know how to put it. It's they're one of those teams where I'm not really excited about stuff, but I don't necessarily think they're gonna pack it in for the year. They're sort of in the middle, right? I mean, does that make sense? They're sort of. I think being out of the playoffs doesn't change my feelings on them. Let's say that.
I completely agree. I think they're going to continue to try to do their best to win games, trying to make a good impression to use that as a starting point for next year and hopefully keep jobs. I mean, yeah, definitely. Hey, speaking about Wallace, I mentioned that I watched this game a lot earlier today. He had a lot of yardage today, but the first was on like a 50-yard pass that was underthrown, that it was a miracle that he caught it. He caught a touchdown as time expired in the first half. That was an amazing catch. It's a real demonstration of everything that Wallace can do. But every time Wallace makes a big play like that, it always feels like a miracle in this team because, one, Tannehill's accuracy on deep balls, and two, just everything else with the team. I agree. I feel like Landry is the guy that's really established himself as the consistent option. And even in this game where they were making a concerted effort to go down the field, Landry still got plenty of work. I feel like he is a totally safe wide receiver 3 to roll with in Week 16 of the playoffs. Okay, the Browns, the poor Browns. They lost their 3rd straight game to fall to 7-7. That I think probably definitely does eliminate them. The other 3 teams in the AFC North actually have 9 wins. Johnny Manziel, rough start in his first debut there. 10 of 18 for 80 yards, no touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Just 13 yards on 5 carries on the ground. The team was shut out 30-0. I mean, pretty much everything went wrong here. Is there any sort of silver lining that can be applied here with Manziel, or is his chance at being a fantasy relevant option for this year at least over with?
I think it's over with. I mean, I don't know. I didn't see a whole lot today that would give me any indication that I would even want to roll the dice with him next week. I mean, like I said, most fantasy leagues are done after next week, and I don't know. I didn't see anything to indicate that he could be relied on, especially in a championship type situation. Did you?
I definitely did not. And next week they're playing my Carolina Panthers. So I definitely wouldn't want to be rolling with him there. The Panthers have been very prone to giving up long rushes, but their pass rush has really been coming on strong of late, and they were tremendously effective today against the Buccaneers. So I definitely do not think it's the time to roll with Manziel. Does this tarnish your expectations for him potentially moving forward? Again, Brian Hoyer will be a free agent after this year. The presumption entering this game, I thought, was that at least Manziel would be the starter in Week 1 of 2015, but is this one game enough to make you worried about that?
No. Look, if we're looking at this from a dynasty perspective, he's still a hold for me. One game will not determine his future worth, at least not for me. Now, if he has these types of games, in Week 16 and 17, he might be downgraded slightly. But again, I think it's way too early. And look, as far as the rest of the guys go on the team, it's a young team. It's a coach that will be back next year. I think they're going to try to play as best they can because, look, they got a lot of young guys that need the experience, so they're going to try to flesh some things out and see what works. So I'm not going to question their effort, but for Manziel anyway, I will not be using him for fantasy purposes. That's for sure.
I think that's a smart play. Okay, one other team here that I think is worth mentioning, that's the Houston Texans. They also fell to 7-7 after their second straight loss here. That featured injury to Ryan Fitzpatrick, and we'll come back to that later. But now that they're probably eliminated from the playoffs, is there anybody there that might be fantasy relevant or loses fantasy relevant status? I'm thinking mainly about Arian Foster, who's definitely been battling injuries. Is he a guy that you think potentially could be rested the final 2 weeks?
I didn't think about being rested. I mean, I don't think if this were earlier in the season, I think there's no doubt that the opinion would be they would rely on him more. But as you noted, with this being so late in the season, they could just shut him down and not want to risk a severe injury heading into the off season. I think that's possible. Personally, I think they will want to keep trying to win games. But that's interesting. I think there's a shot they might shut him down. And look, they've also not been afraid to use Alfred Blue, his backup this year, in some spot starts or just some cleanup time. So yeah, I might be a little hesitant for that. I would definitely monitor, the Roto Worlds of the world over the next week or so to see what their sort of thinking is. Because yeah, I think it's possible that he could see a lot less action than he's used to.
I agree. Without knowing any news right now, I'd definitely be dropping anybody that I don't think is a useful play for me in Week 16, assuming that's my fantasy championship, to pick up Blue, if only to prevent my opponent from potentially using him if he's out there on the wire. So, if you've been riding with two defenses to play the matchups through the fantasy playoffs, figure out which one you want to play this week, and then drop the other one to pick up Blue, just as a way to play defense. And if they announce ahead of time that they're going to rest Foster, then all the better. You can probably use Blue as a running back 2 or at worst or a flex option. Okay, Michael, I think that covers all the teams that their real life records, etc., have maybe created some fantasy implications for next week. So let's look forward a little bit to 2015. I want to go through your top 10 at wide receivers, mainly as an exercise to figure out where exactly Odell Beckham will rank. I mentioned earlier that Beckham had a great game today. That featured 3 touchdowns. I think all 3 of the ones the Giants scored. He's been unbelievable in the second half of this season. So I'm curious whether he's entered your top 10. Let's just start with this. Here are the top 10 wide receivers in standard fantasy points entering today. So that doesn't count Beckham's big game or anyone else's action from Week 15. Here's the top 10. Antonio Brown, Jordy Nelson, Demaryius Thomas, Julio Jones, Jeremy Maclin, T.Y. Hilton, Emmanuel Sanders, Dez Bryant, Randall Cobb, and Mike Evans. Okay, that's a pretty strong top 10. Here are some guys that aren't in the top 10. There are a couple of rookies still in the top 20 in Kelvin Benjamin and Odell Beckham. There are some other rookies in the top 30. That's Sammy Watkins and Jordan Matthews. There's Calvin Johnson and A.J. Green, both who have traditionally been top 2, I would say, wide receivers who've missed some time this year because of injuries. And then there's guys like DeAndre Hopkins and Alshon Jeffrey, who are still very young, still on the rise, and seem like they're tracking to be wide receiver ones, but that's just way too many guys to be in the top 10, Michael. So can you help me sort this out? You just want to go in order and see what we can come up with?
Yeah, I was looking at this a little bit offline, so I've got sort of the makings of a list, and I think we could probably agree on a lot of stuff, and I think we might get to the same place. So.
Okay, well, get us started.
For me, I'm still going Dez Bryant as my top receiver for next year. Is that well? Let's play this game. I'll name one, and you tell me if they're on your top 10, and then we can go back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I got Dez as my top one for next year.
Okay, I mean, Dez is obviously in my top 10. He's also my number 1 in Dynasty, but I'm not sure he's my number 1 in standard leagues for 2015. It's just because the Cowboys have been so effective rushing the ball this season. I feel like that's something they're going to continue to do. They're just a little bit too balanced almost for him to be the number 1 player. So I probably would have him more around 5 or so is my guess.
Okay, and just for an update, because I might be a little biased, Scott, the Cowboys are up 21-0 over Philadelphia, and Dez has 2 touchdowns.
Okay, so he's rising up the board quickly.
It may be extreme recency bias, but I'm gonna go with it. So
there's no reason not to love Dez. It's true.
All right, your turn.
Oof. Is it ridiculous just to go ahead and put Antonio Brown here after what he's done? He's actually still well clear of the field, especially in targets and receptions. I mean, I know he's small, and that's given me questions about his injury concerns in the past, but I feel like he's been so good, and Roethlisberger's been so good that I think I'm ready to give him that credit.
Oh, I agree. Believe me, I wouldn't argue with him being second. I did see a fun fact today. He's got the second most receptions heading into this week through 14 games in a season with like 115, and I think only Marvin Harrison in his heyday with 127 had more. So no, and I don't see any indication of that slowing down anytime soon. So no, certainly top 10. I can roll with that.
Okay, you're up.
I will go Demaryius Thomas for next year.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty safe bet. Top receiver, top quarterback. There's no doubt there.
Completely agree. All right. Is it too soon to go Odell Beckham? I mean, serious question. We know that Victor Cruz will probably be back next year, but it just looks like Beckham's a star. He's had 90 yards receiving or more in like 6 straight games now. I don't know how many touchdowns he scored over that period, but it's probably more than 6. He makes catches maybe I'm just a little bit too wowed by the highlight ability, but I feel like Beckham's a top 5 receiver next year. What are your thoughts?
Like I said, I sort of mapped out a rough draft of a top 10, and I'll just have the spoiler alert now. He did make the top 10, my top 10. Now he barely made it because I did have to find room for Mike Evans, but no, I don't think that's unreasonable. I mean, look. My biggest, and you mentioned it, my biggest concern heading into next year is where Victor Cruz fits into all of that. Because, look, Victor Cruz had just as good a season as Beckham's having a couple years ago. So it's not like it's unreasonable. But, well, okay, maybe not in these spectacular, crazy catches. But statistically, he had an awesome year. So I say all that to say that would be my one hang up on Beckham and ranking him that high. But even then, I mean, look, He's in an offense that is obviously geared towards him. I don't think there's any doubt about that now. He's got Eli's trust. He's got the trust of the coaches, and look, he's proven he can hold up. So, no, I don't think that's unreasonable. Like I said, I've got him in my top 10, so I can't say a whole lot there.
Okay, good. Then you're up with the 5th pick.
And this is where it starts getting to splitting hairs, but. I'd probably go Jordy at this point. I don't think there's any. I think that's about. Knock on wood. I think that's the safest pick you can be for a wide receiver 1 at this point. another top target in a top passing offense with a top quarterback. There's really no surprise there. So
yeah, it really helps a lot to have Aaron Rodgers.
Right. Although not today, but that was a fluke. Don't go selling Aaron Rodgers in dynasty leagues, please.
Yeah, a lot of people I bet got eliminated from the fantasy playoffs by either Peyton Manning last week or by Aaron Rodgers this week.
All right.
Assuming Odell Beckham wasn't the key factor like it was for us.
Right.
Okay, the sixth guy. God, I'm so anti-rookie normally, but I feel like I have to go Mike Evans here too. Over the second half of the year, so since week 9, Evans and Beckham are number 1 and number 2 in fantasy among wide receivers. This is unprecedented levels of production for rookie receivers, and I feel like Evans is that legit as well.
Yeah, he was actually. I personally have him ranked ahead of Beckham, whether it's next year or in dynasty leagues. Personally, but yeah, I'm with you. He's a top 10 option, and look, he's just dominant when he's on the field. I mean, there's no other word that comes to mind for me. So yeah, I personally I think that's a pretty easy choice there.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
That top 10. All right. What are we number 7 now?
Yeah, and again, this is splitting hairs. And you may not agree with this. I'm still going Calvin Johnson. I think I have. I mean, he's just too. Look, he was the top receiver for a good 2 to 3 year stretch. Obviously, been sidelined by injuries this year. Also affected by, quite honestly, Matt Stafford's subpar play, or at least subpar for him. So, but he's still just by himself a physical freak of nature that can take over a game. So, look, if he's your 7th receiver off the board, I think that's pretty good. So,
yeah, I think I'm going to follow along that line of thinking and go AJ Green at 8. This is the guy that was the number 2 receiver until all of this stuff happened, and while he's missed time this year, since he returned from injury, he's actually been pretty spectacular. He's had some really big games. He had a 200-yard receiving game. Hasn't scored as much maybe this year as in the past, but if we weren't surrounded by all of these historical performances, I think everyone would realize that Green has been as good as he's ever been this year. And so that level of consistency makes him just a little bit more attractive to me than guys like Julio Jones and T.Y. Hilton that don't have that same track record.
Well, speaking of, Scott, I would probably put Julio in that spot. And look, obviously he might have the biggest injury risk of anyone on this list, but I mean he's just too good for me to pass up. And given he was hurt this week, but up until this week he had a real shot for breaking Calvin Johnson's single season yardage record. So look, he could put up numbers with the best of them. So if he's the 9th receiver off boards next year, then that's pretty good.
Not too bad. So we're on the 10th pick now?
Yeah, you get the unenviable position of picking the last one, Scott. So
yeah, I have to eliminate everyone but one of Jeremy Maclin, T.Y. Hilton, Emmanuel Sanders, Randall Cobb, my boy Kelvin Benjamin. Oh God, it breaks my heart.
Again, there's a reason why I wanted to go first on this, John.
Okay, I think I'll take T.Y. Hilton here. It's crazy to me how open he just always is. He's got a lot of Antonio Brown in him, although he spends more time down the field, I feel like. But having luck at quarterback makes it really easy for him. I feel like he's demonstrated this year that he can be the guy. So I think I'll go Hilton there.
Yeah, any one of those guys I think could have fit, but for me, it's the situation he's in too. He's in a pass-heavy offense, and until I hear otherwise, he's still a top target there. So, and look, he just puts up yardage-wise anyway, video game numbers at times. I mean,
for sure.
He's the guy that gets 4 catches for 180 yards. So, yeah, I can't fault you for that.
Okay, so it sounds like there's more or less going to be 13 or 14 what we would traditionally think of as wide receiver ones entering drafts next season. Entering this season, I remember talking before the year with you that we had more or less 7 guys, and then I think we were also advocating Nelson and Antonio Brown, so those are some good guys to identify as well. But that sort of limited it to 9 or so players at the position that were sort of well ahead. So we may have 5 extra guys next year. Overall, how does that affect your draft strategy? Do you think the extra wide receivers makes it more important to go elsewhere, maybe running back earlier? Or is that a situation where you say, I want to get 2 of these elite receivers and have them anchor my team, and then try to mix and match at running backs, which obviously haven't been as consistent this year at the top?
Yeah. Oh God, and it's that's just really tough because if you were to get 2 of say Dez and Julio in your draft next year, I mean, man, that would just be crazy. And we've talked about the quarterbacks. You could get a very good quarterback later in the draft too. So, I mean, just imagine a guy like, I don't know, Ryan and Julio and Dez or any one of those guys. But I don't know, man. I might still, depending on my draft position, I might still try for one of those elite running backs, especially if I'm picking towards the front of the draft, earlier in the draft. I would still want a guy I knew was going to be a workhorse in an offense. Whether it was, maybe Eddie Lacy, who is going to get the ball, or even Jamal Charles, and hoping he bounces back. And given even this year when he hasn't touched the ball nearly as much as he did last year, he still has over 1,000 yards from scrimmage through 13, 14 games. So
Jamal Charles?
Yeah.
Oh, Charles has been great. He also was leading the league in touchdowns entering the day. So
yeah,
I think, if you're rolling with Jamal Charles, Matt Forte, Le'Veon Bell, I think there may be 2 or 3 other guys that I'm forgetting offhand, but there were those really elite running backs that I think we're probably saying are still who you should be going after in the top of the draft. But DeMarco Murray, obviously. If I'm beyond that, I think I am going with the double wide receivers, if that's the way that the draft breaks for me. I was in a 16-team league this year that I sort of anchored my team with A.J. Green and Antonio Brown, and that's definitely been a godsend for me, and it's made it so I can play the matchups more with my running backs. And it's almost that the fact that I had poor running backs to start the year has made it more of an emphasis for me to chase the position, and I think that's ended up netting me some better options down the stretch this year. So I think that is a very viable way to go next year. Okay, Michael, third topic tonight, and the last topic of the night, is talking about these replacement quarterbacks. We touched briefly on some of the guys that have gotten in, like Johnny Manziel. You mentioned the Cardinals and all of their quarterback injuries. Let's just go through these guys and let's say maybe you're in a deeper league, maybe a 16-team league like the one that I just mentioned. Or any of these guys, players you can start. I mean, this week was almost apocalyptic for quarterbacks in fantasy. With guys like Aaron Rodgers and Peyton Manning having bad weeks. Even Andrew Luck's week was pretty poor, so that could have eliminated a lot of guys, but it also means that with the other injuries, these other guys may be more in the mix than you would previously have assumed them to be. Let's start with the Carolina game. I mentioned earlier they're hosting Cleveland, so that's actually 2 of the new guys, potentially. Manziel presumably will continue to start there. Derek Anderson today, 25 of 40 for 277 yards, a touchdown, no interceptions. I think he's the number 1 rated quarterback in the league this year. Granted, that's been all against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, so major grain of salt. But Anderson certainly has looked a lot better than he looked through the bulk of his career in Cam Newton's stead this year. We don't really know Newton's health going forward, but it seems crazy to me that he would come back as soon as next week. What are your thoughts on Anderson? Is he a guy that you could potentially start next week?
Personally, I might, yeah. I mean, depending on the situation, look, he's proven that he at least can complete the passes, and he can get the ball downfield, and he's not turning it over. So that right there, I think, gives him a notch above some of the other guys we'll get into. But and look, he's got good players around him in Greg Olsen. I mean, Greg Olsen had 10 catches for over 100 yards today. So if you're a Greg Olsen owner, I think you're kind of hoping for Derek Anderson again next week. But yeah, if I were in a desperate situation, like let's say Manning gets ruled out early, hypothetically, and you don't have Osweiler, and there's just no one left, I would go, Anderson would be at the top of my list, I think.
I agree. I think Anderson's going to be pretty close to my top 15 at the position next week. I just really like his throws the couple times that I've seen him this year. He's just been very accurate in a way that I don't remember him being from his previous seasons, especially back in Browns days. So you're right, and the Panthers have really been running with a more traditional offense with him under center. So I feel pretty good about him. I feel like he's safe. he may end up throwing an interception before the year is over. But I think you're pretty safe there. And today, it really could have been a lot better for Anderson, as the Panthers were in the opponent's red zone all day and they just couldn't convert. I tend to think that's more of a flukish thing than anything else. So I agree. I think Anderson could be a viable starter there. Do you have any additional thoughts on Manziel there? I know we pretty much talked about him. He's probably a guy you're just going to avoid, right?
Yeah, there's, like I said, nothing today indicated that he would be a good option next week. But again, long term, that doesn't change my opinion on him. I still think he'll be pretty good. But look, he's had to sit for 14 weeks, and he's being thrown out there now. And look, they're going to roll with him. He's gonna get some playing time, but it just might be ugly the first couple games. So yeah, I would be avoiding, I think, at that point.
Next up, then, Robert Griffin III. He came on today in relief of Colt McCoy, pretty early in the game, I think. He finished 18 of 27 for 236 yards, a touchdown, no interceptions. More importantly, probably 46 yards rushing on just 5 carries. And the highlight that I saw at the end of the first half looked really weird. It looked like he ran in a touchdown that was nullified because he didn't have strong possession or something along those lines, and it became a touchback. So really weird kind of call there, but it looked like Griffin was playing really well. Also, he's home against Philadelphia next week, a team that is obviously getting beaten up by the Cowboys now, as you mentioned, and a team that increases the number of opportunities their opponents have because of their pace of play. With all of the things going on around Griffin and the Redskins this year, are you going to feel comfortable rolling with Griffin as a top 15 option next week?
Oh, I'm not usually one to look at factors like emotion and stuff like that, but like, is there any more like pissed off quarterback gonna like next week than Robert Griffin? Like, he just wants to completely show Jay Gruden up and go, yeah, you wanted to bench this? Are you kidding me? Like, So, and again, that's not a good reason to start a guy, especially with championships on the line. But look, I think, let's put it this way. I think Griffin is going to do absolutely everything he can to play well. And like you said, he's playing an Eagles team that, as of late anyway, has given up a lot of points. So, top 15, I'd have to look at the other 15, but I would say his arrow's pointing up for me. Let's say that.
I agree. And if you're talking about nonsense emotional reasons, maybe he's auditioning for the starting quarterback job for the Eagles next year. That would be pretty exciting. That's true, too.
Yeah. Because I don't know there's any way he's there next year in Washington. So you got to figure he's going to do his best to look good at that job audition.
For sure. Okay, we touched on Anderson and Griffin. Those are the two guys that I might be willing to roll with in deeper formats. There are a couple of other guys that are options. For me, they're not ones that I would want to use in basically any format, but I'm going to just run them by you, Michael, in case you think I'm wrong. First off, Tom Savage in Houston. Brian Fitzpatrick broke his leg and is out for the year there. They had already gone through their second quarterback in Ryan Mallett as well. Savage finished the day, he's a rookie, by the way, 10 of 19 for 127 yards, no touchdowns and 1 interception. And he hosts Baltimore in Week 16, who really needs that win too. That's a stay away, right?
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, look, it's another rookie. He's very raw. He's third string. He is the third stringer. So, yeah, I don't know any reason that would compel me to start him next week unless literally all 31 other quarterbacks were taken and I just needed one for something.
Agreed. Okay, if Houston ends up benching Arian Foster to rest him up and Tom Savage is starting, by all means pick up the Baltimore Ravens
right.
Special teams. That could be your number one defense next week. And I feel like that's a team that's sort of out there in a lot of leagues. So people playing the matchups take notice of that potentially. Okay, here's another one, a little sad for me as a former fan of the guy, but Jake Locker, injured early in this game. Finally, he got another chance. The career just didn't really happen for Locker, I guess. Charlie Whitehurst came in here, though, for the Titans, 10 of 24 for 203 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. Faces Jacksonville in Week 16. That's a good matchup. But is that enough to make you consider Whitehurst even in deep formats?
No.
Okay.
look, there. I mean, that quarterback position in Tennessee is just cursed right now. I mean, not one quarterback of the three has shown, at least that I can recall, any sort of glimpse of hope. I guess if that's what you want to call it this year. Which,
Sure.
again, I mean, it's interesting because Wisenhunt was brought in specifically to develop the quarterback position, and it just hasn't happened this year. So yeah, I would. Again, I might take him above Tom Savage next week, but that's probably about it.
Yeah, I think Tennessee's probably hoping for the Marcus Mariota draft pick next
Right.
year as they get ready for their future. I will say I think there also are two fantasy implications here, though, even though I'm avoiding Whitehurst for sure. One is that, Jacksonville's defense has been a viable defense. I've actually played them some in deeper formats in the second half of the season. I bet they'll be a top 10 defense for me this week. So I think that's something to take notice of potentially in deeper formats. Second, with Justin Hunter out for the season, Kendall Wright hasn't been healthy either. Nate Washington has been pretty effective over the last two games, especially so here. 6 for 102 on 10 targets. I had him in my top 30 at wide receiver both weeks. I will again next week, even with Whitehurst under center. So that's a guy that's available in a lot of formats. So if you ran into some injuries, maybe you're in a deeper format, maybe you're rolling with some flex running backs with bad matchups, I think you should start Washington over a lot of those types of players. Okay, Michael, I think that clears things up. Any other thoughts about the Week 15 games that are still going on?
No, again, like we touched on, it happens every year where your fantasy studs just put up a zero in the playoffs when you need them most. But look, good luck to everyone that survived this week and is playing next week.
Yep, enjoy your Odell Beckham ownership, everybody that's still alive. All right, Michael, it's been a good show. Hope everyone has good luck in their championship games, and I hope you keep listening to the Fantasy Slant from Pro Football Focus, and we will catch you again soon.